Grace Thompson froze mid-step on the cemetery path, her morning coffee spilling onto weathered stones as she stared at the impossible sight before her. A massive gray wolf was digging frantically beside the unmarked Civil War graves, dirt flying in desperate arcs around his powerful frame. This wasn't some stray dog. This was a predator with ice-blue eyes that seemed to burn with human intelligence. The elderly groundskeeper dropped his rake with a metallic clatter, stumbling backward as his weathered face drained of color. Mrs. Henderson's scream pierced the morning stillness from across the street, her grocery bag scattering across the sidewalk. Grace's breath caught as something metallic glinted in the fresh earth. A dog tag, tarnished but unmistakable. For 3 years since Harold's death, she'd walked this same path every morning, seeking solace among the peaceful dead. Now something ancient and urgent had shattered that sanctuary. The wolf stopped digging and looked directly at her, as if it had been waiting. What had been buried here that demanded such desperate loyalty? And why did those eyes seem to recognize her soul? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Grace Thompson had never imagined that widowhood at 61 would feel like drowning in silence. Every morning for the past 3 years, she set out 2 coffee cups from habit, then poured one back into the pot when reality struck like a cold slap. Harold's empty chair at their kitchen table had become a monument to all the conversations they'd never have, all the plans that died with him on that sterile hospital bed. "What would you do, honey?" she whispered to his photograph each morning, the same question that had become her daily prayer. Harold always knew what to do. During their 42 years of marriage, he'd been her compass through every storm, from her nightmares after serving as an army nurse in Vietnam to the devastating news that they'd never have children of their own. Cedar Falls, Iowa, had been their sanctuary, a town of 8,000 souls where everyone knew your name and your business. Founded in the 1870s by farmers and railroad workers, it bore the scars of every American struggle. The Veterans Memorial Cemetery, established in 1920, held 4 generations of local boys who'd answered their country's call. Grace walked its winding paths every morning, finding comfort among the weathered headstones and the stories they told. Her part-time job at the Cedar Falls Veterans Center kept her connected to purpose but barely covered the bills. Harold's insurance money had evaporated with his medical expenses, leaving Grace to stretch his pension like a worn sweater. She'd sold their good china, his fishing equipment, even his beloved 1987 Chevy pickup. Everything except his photograph and the wedding ring she still couldn't bear to remove. The center housed 37 veterans, men and women whose bodies had returned from foreign wars but whose minds remained trapped in distant battlefields. Grace understood their haunted eyes. She'd seen the same look in her bathroom mirror for decades after Vietnam, where she'd held dying 19-year-olds who cried for their mothers in languages she didn't understand. "Take care of those who can't take care of themselves," Harold had whispered during his final moments, his calloused mechanic's hands squeezing hers with surprising strength. Those words had become her lifeline, the only thing that pulled her from bed each morning. Cedar Falls itself was dying slowly, hemorrhaging young people to Des Moines and Chicago, while the remaining residents grew grayer and more brittle each year. The Lutheran church where she and Harold had wed was down to 50 regular members. Main Street sprouted "for rent" signs like dandelions after rain. Grace felt the weight of invisibility that settles on older women like dust on forgotten furniture. Grocery store clerks looked through her. Bank tellers spoke louder, assuming age meant deafness. Even her own reflection seemed to fade a little more each day, but Harold had always said, "Sometimes God sends angels with 4 legs." He'd rescued countless strays over the years, 3-legged cats, blind dogs, birds with broken wings. Their house had been Noah's Ark for the wounded and forgotten. Grace never expected that philosophy would prepare her for the most extraordinary encounter of her life. Monday morning's encounter with the wolf had left Grace's hands trembling as she poured her solitary cup of coffee. She'd barely slept, Harold's voice echoing in her memory. Sometimes the most broken souls find each other. By Tuesday dawn, an inexplicable pull drew her back to the cemetery, her practical nurse's training warring with something deeper, a recognition she couldn't name. The wolf was there again, exactly where she'd left him. His massive frame hunched over the same spot, paws working methodically through the Iowa clay. Up close, Grace could see the silver threading through his dark fur, the careful way he moved his left hind leg. This wasn't a young predator. This was an old soldier, battle-scarred and weary. When their eyes met, Grace felt a jolt of connection that defied logic. Those ice-blue eyes held intelligence, yes, but more than that. They held grief, the same crushing loneliness that had been her constant companion since Harold's funeral. "What are you looking for, boy?" she whispered, taking a tentative step closer. The wolf paused in his digging and approached her slowly, his massive head lowered in a gesture that seemed almost respectful. At her feet, he dropped something that made Grace's heart skip. A tarnished dog tag, green with age but still readable. Benjamin Morrison, 1st Iowa Infantry, 1863. Grace's nursing background had taught her to research thoroughly before acting. That evening, she spread genealogy records across her kitchen table, Harold's reading glasses perched on her nose. Benjamin Morrison had indeed served with the 1st Iowa Infantry during the Civil War. According to official records, he died at the Battle of Vicksburg in 1863. But there was a discrepancy. His body was never recovered, never sent home for burial. Wednesday brought the wolf back, his persistence both admirable and heartbreaking. Grace found herself looking forward to their strange communion, bringing him water in Harold's old thermos and speaking to him as she once had to her patients. The wolf seemed to understand every word, tilting his great head and fixing her with those knowing eyes. But their peaceful routine shattered when Jake Stevens, a local rancher, confronted Grace at the cemetery gates. "Mrs. Thompson, that animal killed 2 of my lambs last night," he said, his weathered face hard with anger. "Sheriff Morrison's organizing a hunting party. That wolf's gotta go." Grace felt something fierce rise in her chest, a protectiveness she hadn't experienced since her nursing days. "That wolf hasn't hurt anyone, Jake. He's been here with me every morning." "Wolves are predators, Grace. This ain't some Disney movie. When they get a taste for livestock, they don't stop." That afternoon, Grace found herself facing down Sheriff William Morrison in his cramped office. At 64, Bill Morrison commanded respect in Cedar Falls, a Vietnam veteran who'd lost his left leg below the knee and walked with a pronounced limp that somehow made him more formidable, not less. "Grace, I understand you've got a soft spot for strays," he said, not unkindly. "But this animal is dangerous. We've got children in this town." "That wolf isn't dangerous, Bill. He's searching for something. Someone." Morrison's expression hardened. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that gets people hurt. You stay away from that animal, you hear me? I won't have you interfering with public safety." But Grace had made her decision. That evening she packed a thermos of coffee, Harold's old camping chair, and a determination that surprised her with its strength. If the wolf was going to keep vigil, he wouldn't do it alone. As she settled beside the persistent digger under a blanket of Iowa stars, Grace felt more alive than she had in 3 years. Thursday night brought dreams that felt more like memories than imagination. Grace found herself back in the makeshift field hospital outside Saigon, the humid air thick with the metallic scent of blood and the antiseptic that never quite masked the smell of death. In her dream, a young soldier with Benjamin Morrison's face reached out to her, his lips moving soundlessly as mortar shells exploded in the distance. She woke with tears on her cheeks and an inexplicable certainty that something was terribly wrong. The wolf was on her front porch. Grace pulled on Harold's old cardigan and stepped into the cool Iowa night. The massive animal rose to his feet, his ice-blue eyes reflecting the porch light with an urgency that made her pulse quicken. He padded to the edge of the steps, looked back at her, then trotted toward the street. "You want me to follow you, don't you?" Grace whispered, her practical mind warring with an instinct older than reason. The wolf led her through Cedar Falls' sleeping streets, past the darkened windows of neighbors who'd known her for decades, past the Lutheran church where she and Harold had promised to love each other through sickness and health. The cemetery gates stood open, as they always did. Cedar Falls was the kind of town where people trusted the living and respected the dead. Under the pale glow of a three-quarter moon, the wolf resumed his digging with renewed desperation. Grace knelt beside him, her arthritic knees protesting against the damp earth. Using her hands, she began to help, dirt collecting under her nails as they worked together in silent partnership. At 4 feet down, her fingers struck something solid. "Oh my God," Grace breathed, brushing soil away from what appeared to be a wooden box, weathered but intact. The wolf stepped back, his massive head tilted, watching her with an expression that seemed almost expectant. Grace's nursing training had taught her to think clearly under pressure, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. With trembling hands, she cleared away more earth, revealing a wooden crate roughly the size of a footlocker. Metal hinges, green with age, held it closed. Friday morning's discovery left Grace shaking as she sat in her kitchen trying to process what she'd found. Inside the wooden box were items that defied everything she thought she knew about Benjamin Morrison's story. A Union Army uniform, carefully folded and surprisingly well preserved, personal letters tied with a faded ribbon, a small leather journal with pages so fragile they seemed ready to crumble at her touch. But it was the child's clothing that broke her heart. A boy's shirt, no bigger than what a 10-year-old might wear, and tiny shoes that had been carefully placed beside the other items as if they were treasures. Grace opened the journal with the reverence reserved for sacred texts. The handwriting was cramped but legible, the ink faded to brown. June 15, 1863. Found the boy today, half dead from fever and fear. His folks were killed in the raid on Millerville. Says his name is Thomas Whitman. Can't be more than 8 years old. What kind of war makes orphans of babies? Her hands shook as she turned the page. June 20th, 1863. Thomas is stronger now. Follows me everywhere like a lost pup. Makes me think of my own boy back home, though Samuel would be near grown by now. This war has taken so much from all of us. The entries continued, painting a picture that contradicted every official record Grace had found. Benjamin Morrison hadn't died at Vicksburg. He'd deserted, but not from cowardice. He'd found a child who needed protecting, and he'd chosen compassion over duty. July 4th, 1863, Independence Day. Though there's precious little freedom in hiding like rabbits. Thomas asked me today if we're going to die. I told him we're going to live, but I'm not sure I believe it myself. If something happens to me, I pray someone will remember that this boy deserves a chance at the life his parents wanted for him. The final entries were written in a different hand, smaller, more careful, clearly that of a child. Papa Ben is very sick. The fever came back worse than before. He told me to write in his book so people will know what happened. He says we're family now, even if we don't have the same blood. I'm scared. But Papa Ben says brave boys take care of each other. Grace closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. Outside her kitchen window, she could see the wolf sitting patiently by her mailbox, as if he knew she needed time to absorb the truth. The sound of heavy footsteps on her porch interrupted her reverie. Through the window she saw Sheriff Morrison approaching, his expression grim. Behind him, 3 deputies flanked the walkway. Grace quickly gathered the artifacts, her heart pounding as she heard Morrison's authoritative knock. "Grace Thompson, open up. We need to talk about that wolf of yours." Grace clutched the journal to her chest as Sheriff Morrison's knocking grew more insistent. Through her lace curtains, she could see the wolf had vanished, a disappearing act that seemed to be his specialty whenever authority figures appeared. "Just a minute, Bill," she called, quickly wrapping the artifacts in Harold's old army blanket and sliding them under her kitchen table. Her hands shook as she opened the door to find Morrison flanked by 2 deputies, their expressions stern in the morning light. "Grace, we've got a problem," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of official business. "That wolf killed 3 more sheep last night at the Henderson farm. This has gone too far." "That's impossible," Grace replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "The wolf was here all night. I saw him on my porch around midnight." Deputy Martinez, a young man Grace had known since he was Tommy Henderson's little boy, shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Thompson, with all due respect, maybe you didn't see what you think you saw. It was dark, and I'm not some addled old woman who sees things that aren't there," Grace interrupted, steel creeping into her voice. "I know what I saw." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Grace, nobody's questioning your faculties, but this animal is becoming a danger to the community. I've got ranchers calling for a hunting party, and I can't protect something that's killing livestock." Grace studied Morrison's face, noting the tension lines around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when he mentioned the hunting party. There was something he wasn't telling her, something that went deeper than concern for a few sheep. "Bill, what do you know about Benjamin Morrison?" she asked quietly. The change in Morrison's demeanor was immediate and startling. His face went pale, and his hand gripped his walking cane so tightly his knuckles went white. "What kind of question is that?" "The kind that deserves an honest answer. That wolf found something in the cemetery, something connected to your ancestor. I think you know more about this than you're letting on." Morrison glanced at his deputies, then back at Grace. "Boys, why don't you wait in the cruiser? Mrs. Thompson and I need to have a private conversation." After the deputies retreated, Morrison's official mask slipped away, revealing the exhausted face of a man carrying a burden too heavy for one person. He sank into Harold's old chair without invitation, his artificial legs stretched out stiffly. "Grace, there are some family matters that are better left buried," he said quietly. "The Morrison name means something in this town. My grandfather was a war hero. My father served in Korea. I served in Vietnam. We've built our reputation on service and sacrifice." "And Benjamin Morrison?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Benjamin Morrison was a deserter. He abandoned his unit at Vicksburg, left good men to die while he ran away. It's been the family shame for over a century and a half. That's why there's no grave marker for him in the cemetery. He doesn't deserve to be honored alongside real heroes." Grace felt anger flare in her chest. "Bill Morrison, you're talking about a man you never met based on stories that might not even be true. What if you're wrong? What if Benjamin Morrison had reasons for what he did that your family never understood? Some things are better left alone, Grace. That wolf needs to be dealt with before someone gets hurt. I'm giving you 24 hours to convince it to move on, or I'm authorizing a hunting party." After Morrison left, Grace sat in her kitchen feeling the weight of impossible choices. She pulled the journal from its hiding place and read Benjamin's words again, seeing in them not the cowardice Morrison's family believed, but the desperate love of a man trying to save an innocent child. That afternoon, Grace made a decision that would have shocked the cautious woman she'd been before Harold's death. She drove to the Cedar Falls Library and spent 3 hours researching everything she could find about the Civil War in Iowa, about desertion rates, about what happened to children orphaned by the conflict. What she discovered painted a picture far different from the simple narrative Morrison's family had accepted. Desertion rates in 1863 were astronomical, not from cowardice, but from soldiers receiving desperate letters from home about families facing starvation, children dying of disease, farms being lost to debt. Many men faced impossible choices between duty to country and duty to family. More importantly, Grace found records of civilian casualties from Confederate raids throughout Iowa in 1863. The raid on Millerville that Benjamin Morrison had mentioned in his journal was real. 17 families had been killed, including multiple children named Whitman. Armed with this information, Grace drove to the Iowa Historical Society in Des Moines, her old Honda Civic rattling along Highway 20 as she pushed it harder than she had in years. Dr. Sarah Evans, the chief genealogist, was a woman about Grace's age with kind eyes and capable hands. "Mrs. Thompson, this is fascinating research," Dr. Evans said after examining photocopies of the journal pages. "If these documents are authentic, and preliminary examination suggests they are, you found evidence of a Civil War story that's never been told. Can you help me prove it?" "I can try. But Mrs. Thompson, are you prepared for what you might find?" Sometimes the truth is more complicated than the stories we tell ourselves. That evening, Grace sat in the cemetery beside the wolf, watching the sun set over Cedar Falls. The animal had returned as she'd somehow known he would, settling beside her with the patient dignity of a creature who understood waiting. "I don't know what you are," she said quietly, scratching behind his ears as she might have petted one of Harold's strays. "But I know you're not here to hurt anyone. You're here because someone you loved is still lost, aren't you?" The wolf looked at her with those remarkable blue eyes, and Grace felt a connection that transcended species, the recognition of one grieving soul by another. Her peaceful moment was shattered by the sound of truck engines and shouting voices. Jake Stevens' pickup led a convoy of 4 vehicles into the cemetery parking area, men with rifles silhouetted against their headlights. "There it is," Stevens shouted, pointing at the wolf. "Mrs. Thompson, you get away from that animal right now." Grace stood slowly, placing herself between the wolf and the armed men. Behind her, she could feel the animal's tension, coiled and ready to flee or fight. "Jake Stevens, you put that rifle down this instant," Grace said, her voice carrying the authority she'd once used with panicked soldiers in Vietnam. "This wolf hasn't hurt anyone." "That thing killed my sheep, Grace. It's a predator, and predators don't change their nature." "Sometimes predators protect the things they love," Grace replied. "Sometimes they're the only ones brave enough to do what needs to be done." Sheriff Morrison's cruiser pulled up behind the trucks, his flashing lights casting red and blue shadows across the headstones. He approached the tense standoff with his hand raised, trying to defuse the situation. "Grace, you need to step away from that animal. These men have legal right to protect their property." "And I have a legal right to be in a public cemetery," Grace shot back. "This wolf was here first, Bill. Maybe instead of trying to kill him, we should try to understand what he's searching for." The wolf seemed to sense the escalating tension. He rose to his feet, magnificent and wild in the artificial light, his ice-blue eyes reflecting back at the assembled crowd like ancient stars. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the wolf did something that stunned everyone present. He walked slowly toward Sheriff Morrison, sat down at his feet and looked up at him with an expression that seemed almost pleading. Morrison stared down at the animal, his face going through a series of emotions Grace couldn't quite read. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Dear God, those eyes, I know those eyes. The wolf's behavior had shattered the standoff like glass hitting concrete. Sheriff Morrison stared down at the magnificent animal with an expression that cycled through disbelief, recognition, and something that looked dangerously close to terror. His artificial leg trembled slightly as he leaned heavily on his walking cane. "Bill, what is it?" Grace asked, stepping closer to the sheriff while keeping one protective hand extended toward the wolf. "What do you see?" Morrison's face had gone ashen in the harsh glare of the truck headlights. "Those eyes," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of confused ranchers. "I've seen those eyes before." Jake Stevens shifted his rifle impatiently. "Sheriff, we didn't come here for a nature documentary. That animal needs to be put down before it kills again. Nobody's shooting anything until I understand what's happening here," Morrison snapped, his authority cutting through the tension like a blade. The wolf remained seated at his feet, utterly calm despite being surrounded by armed men. Grace seized the moment. "Bill, I found something. Something that changes everything we thought we knew about Benjamin Morrison." She pulled the weathered journal from her jacket pocket, its leather binding dark with age. "Your ancestor wasn't a coward. He was a hero." Morrison's eyes fixed on the journal with the intensity of a man seeing a ghost. "Where did you get that?" "The wolf led me to it. Benjamin Morrison didn't desert his unit. He saved a child. An 8-year-old boy named Thomas Whitman, whose family was killed in a Confederate raid. Benjamin chose to protect an innocent life over military protocol." "That's impossible," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "My family has records, official documents. Benjamin Morrison was listed as a deserter." Grace opened the journal carefully, her fingers tracing Benjamin's faded handwriting. "Listen to his words, Bill." July 10th, 1863. "Thomas grows stronger each day. Reminds me of my own boy back home. This war has taken so much, but maybe we can save something innocent from all this madness." The assembled ranchers shifted restlessly, their initial bloodlust cooling into confusion. Deputy Martinez cleared his throat. "Sheriff, maybe we should—" "Be quiet, Martinez." Morrison's voice was sharp with concentration. He studied Grace's face in the artificial light, searching for deception and finding none. "Read more." Grace turned the fragile pages, finding Benjamin's final entries. August 2nd, 1863. "The fever has me bad now. Thomas tries to care for me like I cared for him. Brave little soldier. If we don't make it through this, I want folks to know that saving this boy was the most important thing I ever did. More important than any battle, any medal, any glory." Morrison's cane slipped from his grasp, clattering against the cemetery stones. The wolf immediately nuzzled the fallen cane closer to the sheriff's hand, a gesture so clearly helpful that even Jake Stevens lowered his rifle slightly. "There's more," Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. "The boy wrote the final entries himself. Papa Ben died in the night. He told me to be brave, to remember that family isn't just blood. It's choosing to love someone when you don't have to. I don't know what will happen to me, but I know Papa Ben was the best father a boy could have." Sheriff Morrison sank heavily onto a nearby headstone, his face buried in his hands. The wolf moved closer, resting his massive head against Morrison's knee in a gesture of comfort so human-like that several of the ranchers stepped back in amazement. "Bill," Grace said gently, "what do you know that you haven't told us?" Morrison raised his head, and Grace was shocked to see tears streaming down the weathered veteran's face. "My great-great-grandfather wasn't Benjamin Morrison," he said quietly. "His name was Thomas Whitman. He was adopted by the Morrison family after they found him wandering alone near the cemetery in 1863, half dead from fever and exposure." The revelation hit Grace like a physical blow. Thomas survived. Thomas survived, and he never forgot Benjamin Morrison's sacrifice. My family has been living a lie for over a century and a half. We built our reputation on dishonoring the memory of the man who saved our bloodline. Jake Stevens lowered his rifle completely, confusion evident on his face. "Sheriff, I don't understand what any of this has to do with—" His words were cut off by a sound that made everyone freeze, a faint crying coming from beneath their feet. Not the wind through the cemetery trees, not an animal in distress, but the unmistakable sound of human sobbing echoing up from underground. The wolf leaped to his feet, every muscle in his powerful body tensing. He trotted quickly to a spot about 10 feet from where Grace had found the journal and began digging with renewed desperation, whimpering with an urgency that seemed to communicate something vital. "Dear God," Morrison breathed, struggling to his feet. "There's someone down there." Grace knelt beside the wolf, pressing her ear to the ground. The crying was clearer now, definitely human, definitely alive, and definitely coming from below. "How is that possible? This cemetery is over 100 years old." The wolf's digging had revealed something that shouldn't exist, a modern metal grate partially covered by decades of accumulated soil and debris. Through the gaps they could see darkness, but the sound of human breathing was unmistakable. Deputy Martinez grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. We need fire rescue at the cemetery immediately." "We have someone trapped underground." Morrison knelt beside Grace and the wolf, his trained law enforcement mind trying to process the impossible. "Grace, that's not a grave. That's some kind of shelter or bunker. How long has someone been down there?" The wolf looked directly at Morrison with those piercing blue eyes, and the sheriff felt a chill of recognition that went deeper than memory. Somewhere in his family's buried history, those eyes had watched over a frightened child named Thomas Whitman. Now, it seemed, history was repeating itself. The fire department's rescue operation transformed the quiet cemetery into a scene from Grace's worst nightmares. Floodlights blazed against the darkness, casting harsh shadows between the headstones as rescue workers carefully excavated around the metal grate. The wolf had retreated to a respectful distance but refused to leave entirely, his ice-blue eyes tracking every movement with the intensity of a sentinel standing guard. Captain Roy Henderson, Jake Stevens' older brother, supervised the delicate operation of lifting the grate without causing a cave-in. "Whoever's down there has been calling for help on and off for the past hour," he reported to Sheriff Morrison. "Sounds like an elderly male, possibly injured or disoriented." Grace stood at the perimeter, her nursing instincts warring with a growing sense of dread. Something about this situation felt wrong in ways she couldn't articulate. The wolf's behavior suggested he'd known about the person underground, but how long had someone been trapped beneath Cedar Falls Cemetery? And why had no one reported them missing? When the grate finally came free, the truth that emerged from that underground chamber would shatter everything Grace thought she understood about loyalty, sacrifice, and the price of keeping family secrets. "Hello down there," Captain Henderson called into the opening. "Can you hear me? We're here to help." A voice drifted up from the darkness, weak, confused, but unmistakably human. "Is that you, Billy? I've been waiting so long, so very long." Sheriff Morrison went rigid beside Grace, his face draining of all color. "That voice," he whispered, gripping Grace's arm with desperate strength. "That's impossible." "Who is it, Bill?" Grace asked, though something in his expression was already providing the answer she didn't want to hear. "Tommy," Morrison breathed, the word emerging like a prayer and a curse combined. "My brother Tommy." The revelation hit Grace like a physical blow. Morrison had never mentioned having a brother. In all the years she'd known him, he'd presented himself as an only child who'd inherited the family's military legacy alone. Captain Henderson was already rappelling down into the chamber with rescue equipment. His voice echoed up from below, tight with professional control. "We've got a male, approximately 60 to 70 years old, severely dehydrated and malnourished but conscious. He's been living in some kind of makeshift shelter down here." "Living down here?" Grace repeated, her mind struggling to process the implications. "Bill, how long has your brother been missing?" Morrison's artificial leg nearly buckled beneath him as the full weight of his secret crashed down. Jake Stevens and the other ranchers stared at their sheriff with expressions ranging from confusion to growing horror. 43 years, Morrison whispered, his voice breaking. "Tommy disappeared in 1980, right after he came back from Vietnam. Everyone assumed he'd wandered off during one of his, episodes. PTSD was different then. We didn't understand it, didn't know how to help." Grace felt the pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place. "You knew he was alive. All these years you knew." Morrison's confession poured out like blood from a reopened wound. Tommy couldn't handle being around people after the war. The crowds, the noise, the questions about what he'd seen over there. He'd disappear for days, then weeks. "When he didn't come home that winter, we searched everywhere. Then I found this place, this shelter he'd built underneath the cemetery. He felt safe with the dead," he said. "They didn't ask him to explain what happened in the jungle." "So you let everyone think he was dead?" Deputy Martinez asked, his young voice thick with disbelief. "I brought him food, medical supplies, books. I thought it was temporary, that eventually he'd get better, come home. But the years passed and Tommy got more and more disconnected from the world above ground. He started talking to the graves like they were old friends. He said the dead understood him better than the living ever could." Captain Henderson's voice crackled through the radio. "We're bringing him up now. He's asking for someone named Benjamin. Keeps saying he promised to take care of Benjamin." The wolf's ears perked up at the name, and he moved closer to the rescue operation, his massive head tilted as if listening for something only he could hear. Grace watched Sheriff Morrison's carefully constructed life crumble around him. "Bill, why didn't you get him professional help?" "There are facilities, programs for veterans." "You don't understand," Morrison said desperately. "Tommy was there when the Morrison family massacre happened in '72. Our parents, our younger sister, home invasion gone wrong. Tommy survived because he was hiding in the basement during one of his episodes. He blamed himself, said he should have protected them. After that, he couldn't bear to be responsible for anyone else getting hurt." As the rescue team carefully lifted Tommy Morrison from his underground sanctuary, Grace began to understand the terrible mathematics of survival guilt. Two brothers, both veterans, both carrying wounds that had never properly healed. One had tried to maintain a normal life while secretly caring for the other, who had chosen the company of the dead over the judgment of the living. But the wolf's presence suggested this story had layers yet to be revealed. Tommy Morrison emerged from his underground sanctuary like a figure from another era, blinking in the harsh glare of the rescue lights with eyes that held decades of accumulated sorrow. At 71, he was skeletal thin, his gray hair hanging in matted strands around a face that bore the deep lines of a man who had carried too much pain for too long. But it was his eyes that broke Grace's heart, the same ice-blue shade as the wolf's, filled with a gentleness that seemed impossible after 43 years of self-imposed exile. "Billy?" Tommy's voice cracked as he focused on his younger brother. "You got so old, little brother. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't come back up." Sheriff Morrison's carefully maintained composure finally shattered completely. He hobbled forward on his artificial leg, tears streaming down his weathered face as he embraced the brother everyone in Cedar Falls had assumed was dead. "Tommy, we need to get you to a hospital." "You need help." But Tommy's attention had already shifted to the massive wolf standing at the edge of the rescue perimeter, his face transformed with a joy so pure it was painful to witness. "Benjamin, you came back. I knew you wouldn't leave me alone down there forever." Grace felt the world tilt on its axis. Tommy, that wolf isn't Benjamin Morrison. Benjamin died over 150 years ago. Tommy looked at her with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to a child. No, ma'am. Benjamin's been taking care of me for years. Brings me rabbits when I get too weak to hunt. Keeps the bad dreams away when the voices get too loud. He promised he'd never abandon someone who needed protecting. Dr. Susan Martinez, the veterinarian who had arrived with the paramedics, stepped forward with professional curiosity. Sir, that animal is a wild wolf. Wolves don't typically form bonds with humans, especially not to the extent you're describing. Benjamin's different, Tommy said with absolute conviction. He understands what it's like to lose everything trying to save someone. He's been waiting just like I have. Grace studied the wolf, trying to reconcile Tommy's claims with biological reality. The animal's behavior had indeed been extraordinary. The specific digging locations, the way he'd led her to the journal, his protective stance around Tommy during the rescue. But there had to be a rational explanation. Sheriff Morrison was gently examining his brother, noting the scars on his arms and the way Tommy favored his left side. Tommy, how have you been surviving down there all these years, the shelter, the food? Benjamin helps, Tommy said simply. And sometimes I come up at night to gather things from the town. People leave food in their garbage cans, throw away clothes that still have wear in them. Amazing what folks consider trash. Deputy Martinez cleared his throat uncomfortably. Sheriff, we've had reports of missing items over the years. Small stuff, canned goods from porches, blankets from clothes lines. We always assumed it was transients passing through. Grace felt another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Tommy, how long has the wolf been coming to see you? Tommy's face scrunched in concentration, clearly struggling with the concept of linear time. Hard to say exactly. Time moves different down there. But I'd guess maybe 15 years. He was smaller when we first met, still had some puppy in him. Found me during one of the bad times, when the jungle sounds were so loud I couldn't think straight. Dr. Martinez made notes in her tablet. A 15-year-old wolf would be extremely elderly for the species. Most wild wolves don't live beyond 12 years. Benjamin's tougher than most, Tommy said with pride. Had to be, to survive what he's survived. Grace knelt beside Tommy as the paramedics prepared him for transport to the regional hospital. Something in his manner suggested he knew more about the wolf's origins than his simple words conveyed. Tommy, where do you think Benjamin came from? Wolves haven't been native to Iowa for over a century. Tommy's expression grew distant, as if he was accessing memories from deep storage. There was a man used to come around the cemetery sometimes, back in the early days after I went underground, Vietnam vet like me, but older. He'd sit by one of the graves and talk to someone named Harold. Had this dog with him. Big, beautiful animal with eyes like winter sky. Grace's heart stopped. Harold? Harold Thompson? That's the name? You knew him? He was my husband. Grace's voice was barely a whisper. Harold died 3 years ago. Tommy nodded slowly. The man stopped coming around then. But the dog, or maybe it was part wolf, hard to tell, he kept visiting the grave. One day he found his way down to my shelter. We recognized each other, I think. Both of us lost someone we couldn't live without. The revelation sent shockwaves through Grace's understanding of everything that had happened. Harold had never mentioned visiting the cemetery regularly, never talked about having a dog during his later years. But then, Harold had kept many things private, especially about his own struggles with memories from his brief military service. Dr. Martinez was studying the wolf with renewed interest. Mrs. Thompson, did your husband ever mention having contact with wolves or wolf-dog hybrids? Grace searched her memory, trying to piece together fragments of conversations with Harold about his past. He worked at the grain elevator for 40 years, but before that, he did some kind of government work after he got out of the service. He never talked much about it, said it was classified. Sheriff Morrison looked up from where he was helping the paramedics stabilize his brother. Grace, Harold worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service in the 70s. I remember now. There was some kind of program involving wolf reintroduction research, highly controversial at the time. The wolf chose that moment to approach Grace directly, moving with the deliberate care of an animal making an important decision. He sat before her and gently placed his massive paw on her hand, his ice-blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that seemed to communicate volumes. Tommy smiled from his stretcher. He's telling you it's okay to remember, ma'am. Sometimes the people we love keep secrets to protect us, but the truth always finds a way to surface. Grace felt tears streaming down her cheeks as fragmented memories began coalescing into a coherent picture. Harold's unexplained absences during their early marriage, his knowledge of animal behavior that seemed too extensive for a grain elevator worker, the way he'd always known exactly what injured animals needed, as if he'd been trained in wildlife rehabilitation. Harold was part of a wolf research program, she said slowly, the truth emerging like dawn breaking over the prairie. And this wolf, this is one of his animals, isn't it? The wolf's response was to rest his great head against her knee, a gesture of comfort and confirmation that transcended species barriers. In that moment, Grace understood that her husband's final gift to her hadn't been just words about caring for those who couldn't care for themselves. Harold had sent her a guardian, a living bridge between her lonely present and the love they'd shared for 42 years. But the most extraordinary revelation was yet to come. 6 weeks after Tommy Morrison's rescue, Grace Thompson's life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The spare bedroom that had stood empty since Harold's death now housed a man who was simultaneously childlike and wise, damaged and healing. Tommy had adapted to life above ground with surprising resilience, though he still preferred the quiet hours of dawn and dusk when the world felt less overwhelming. The wolf, whom Tommy insisted on calling Benjamin despite all rational arguments, had become a permanent fixture in Grace's daily routine. Dr. Martinez's extensive examination had revealed something remarkable. The animal showed signs of having been professionally trained, with healed surgical scars suggesting he'd received veterinary care far beyond what a wild wolf would typically experience. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Martinez said during one of her weekly visits, "I've been in contact with the Fish and Wildlife Service about your husband's employment records. What I discovered might explain a lot about Benjamin's behavior." Grace set down her coffee cup, noting how Tommy automatically moved to sit beside the wolf whenever official-sounding conversations began. The bond between man and animal had deepened into something that reminded Grace of Harold's relationship with his most damaged patients, built on mutual understanding of pain and the healing power of unconditional acceptance. Harold was part of something called the Guardian Program, Dr. Martinez continued. Between 1975 and 1985, the government conducted research into using wolves and wolf-dog hybrids as therapy animals for veterans suffering from what we now call PTSD. The program was highly classified and ultimately discontinued due to budget constraints and public opposition. Sheriff Morrison, who had become a regular visitor as he rebuilt his relationship with his brother, leaned forward with interest. "So Benjamin is actually a trained therapy animal?" "More than that," Dr. Martinez replied, consulting her tablet. "According to the records I was able to access, Benjamin was part of the final generation of Guardian Program animals. He was specifically trained to work with combat veterans experiencing severe psychological trauma. The program paired these specially trained wolves with veterans who had become unable to function in normal social situations." Grace felt pieces of Harold's hidden life clicking into place. Harold never told me about any of this. Tommy spoke up quietly, his voice carrying the careful cadence he'd developed for discussing difficult topics. The men in those programs, they weren't supposed to talk about it. Government made them sign papers saying they'd go to prison if they ever told anyone. Harold was protecting you the only way he knew how. But why didn't Benjamin stay with Harold? Grace asked. Why did he end up with you, Tommy? Tommy's expression grew thoughtful as he absently stroked Benjamin's massive head. Harold brought him to me in 1985, right after the program got shut down. Harold said Benjamin needed someone who understood what it was like to carry ghosts. We were both broken in similar ways, I guess. Dr. Martinez made notes as Tommy spoke. That would explain Benjamin's extraordinary longevity. The Guardian program animals received the best possible veterinary care, including experimental treatments designed to extend their working lives. Benjamin is probably closer to 20 years old, which is virtually unheard of for his species. Grace studied the wolf with new understanding. So when Harold died, Benjamin came looking for me because Harold taught him that family takes care of family, Tommy finished softly. And because Benjamin could sense you were carrying the same kind of pain Harold used to help him heal. The sound of footsteps on the front porch interrupted their conversation. Grace opened the door to find Pastor David Miller, accompanied by an elderly woman she didn't immediately recognize. The stranger was perhaps 80 years old, with silver hair and eyes that held the particular brightness of someone who had lived long enough to understand that every day was a gift. Grace, I'd like you to meet Margaret Whitman, Pastor Miller said with barely contained excitement. She drove down from Minneapolis after hearing about the discovery of Benjamin Morrison's journal. Grace invited them in, noting how Benjamin immediately approached the elderly woman with the same careful courtesy he showed all visitors. Margaret knelt stiffly and allowed the wolf to sniff her hand, her face lighting up with delight. Mrs. Thompson, Pastor Miller tells me you found evidence that Benjamin Morrison saved a child named Thomas Whitman during the Civil War, Margaret said, settling into Harold's old chair with grateful acceptance of Tommy's offered cushion. That's right. The journal entries were quite clear about Benjamin's relationship with the boy. Margaret smiled, reaching into her purse to withdraw a small leather-bound photograph album. Thomas Whitman was my great-great-grandfather. Our family has kept his story alive for 5 generations, but we never had proof of what really happened to him during the war. Grace felt her heart racing as Margaret opened the album to reveal faded sepia photographs dating back to the 1880s. The first image showed a young man in his 20s, standing proudly beside a modest farmhouse with a woman and 2 small children. This is Thomas Whitman in 1885, Margaret explained. He married my great-great-grandmother Sarah Mitchell and raised 4 children on a farm outside Cedar Falls. He lived to be 83 years old and never forgot the man who saved his life. Margaret turned the page to reveal something that made Grace gasp. It was a photograph of Thomas Whitman as an elderly man, perhaps in his 70s, kneeling beside a large dog with distinctive markings and piercing light-colored eyes. Thomas always kept dogs that looked like this, Margaret continued. He said they reminded him of the loyalty Benjamin Morrison had shown him. He bred them specifically for their intelligence and protective instincts. Our family has maintained that bloodline for over a century. Tommy leaned forward, studying the photograph with intense interest. Ma'am, are you saying Benjamin here might be related to your family's dogs? Margaret's smile broadened. More than related, Mr. Morrison. When I heard about your wolf, I contacted the current breeder in our family line. 3 years ago, one of their males escaped during a thunderstorm and was never recovered. A male with ice blue eyes and unusual intelligence, trained as a therapy dog for veterans before he got spooked by fireworks and ran off. The revelation struck the room like lightning. Benjamin wasn't an ancient wolf carrying supernatural loyalty across generations. He was a descendant of dogs bred specifically to honor Benjamin Morrison's memory, trained to help veterans like Tommy, and had found his way to exactly the people who needed him most. Dr. Martinez was frantically taking notes. That explains everything. His training, his behavior, his longevity. He's not a pure wolf at all. He's a wolf-dog hybrid from a carefully maintained bloodline, bred for the specific traits that made the original Guardian program animals so effective. Grace knelt beside Benjamin, looking into those remarkable eyes with new understanding. You weren't searching for Civil War ghosts, were you, boy? You were looking for Tommy. Your training told you there was someone who needed help, and you kept searching until you found him. Benjamin's response was to rest his massive head in Grace's lap, his tail wagging slowly in what could only be described as contentment. Margaret reached into her purse again, withdrawing a manila envelope. Mrs. Thompson, there's one more thing. When I contacted the VA about Thomas Whitman's military pension records, they found something interesting. Your husband, Harold Thompson, was listed as the primary contact for the Whitman family bloodline. He'd been receiving annual reports about the breeding program and the placement of therapy dogs with veterans. Grace opened the envelope with trembling hands to find copies of correspondence between Harold and the Whitman family dating back 15 years. The letters revealed Harold's role not just as a former Guardian program participant, but as a coordinator, helping place specially trained dogs with veterans in need. The final letter, dated just 2 weeks before Harold's death, contained instructions that made Grace's eyes fill with tears. If something happens to me, please ensure that Benjamin finds his way to my wife, Grace Thompson, in Cedar Falls. She'll need him more than she knows, and there's a veteran in the cemetery area who will need both of them. Benjamin will know what to do. Tommy was crying openly now, understanding finally dawning on his weathered face. Harold knew about me. All those years I thought I was forgotten, and Harold was making sure I'd have help when I needed it most. Pastor Miller cleared his throat gently. It seems to me that what we have here isn't a supernatural story, but something even more remarkable. 3 generations of people who understood that healing happens when broken souls take care of each other. Grace looked around her living room at the family that had formed around her. Tommy with his gentle wisdom, Benjamin with his patient loyalty, and the growing circle of people who had been drawn into their story of survival and care. Outside, the Iowa sun was setting over Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. For the first time since Harold's death, Grace felt truly at peace, understanding finally that love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to serve. 3 months had passed since the truth about Benjamin's identity had been revealed, and Grace Thompson's house on Maple Street had become something she'd never expected, a haven for healing hearts. The spare bedroom that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with Tommy's gentle laughter as he worked on the 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzles that helped calm his mind. Benjamin had claimed the sunny spot by the kitchen window where he could watch the street for visitors while staying close to his chosen family. The morning routine had evolved into something sacred. Grace would wake at dawn, put on the coffee, and find Tommy already up, sitting on the back porch with Benjamin at his side. They'd watch the sun rise over the cornfields beyond town, sharing the comfortable silence of 2 people who understood that not all pain needed words to be acknowledged. "You know what I realized yesterday?" Tommy said one morning, his voice carrying the wonder of someone discovering something precious. "I haven't had the nightmare about the helicopter crash in over a month." Grace settled into the porch swing with her coffee, noting how much healthier Tommy looked. Regular meals and gentle companionship had filled out his gaunt frame, and his eyes held a clarity that seemed to grow stronger each day. The healing comes in its own time, doesn't it? "Benjamin here taught me that," Tommy replied, scratching behind the dog's ears. "He doesn't try to fix everything at once, just stays close and lets you know you're not alone with whatever's hurting you." Dr. Martinez had become a regular visitor, documenting Benjamin's remarkable story for veterinary journals while also monitoring Tommy's progress. Her most recent visit had brought news that both thrilled and worried Grace. "There's a documentary filmmaker from Des Moines who wants to tell your story," Dr. Martinez had explained. "She's particularly interested in the connection between the Civil War Journal, the Guardian program, and how Benjamin found his way to both of you." Grace had been hesitant about publicity, but Tommy surprised her with his enthusiasm. "Maybe our story could help other folks who are struggling," he'd said. "There's got to be other veterans out there who think they're too broken to be part of a family again." The documentary crew had spent a week in Cedar Falls, interviewing Grace, Tommy, Sheriff Morrison, and even Margaret Whitman, who had driven down from Minneapolis again to share the Whitman family's century-long commitment to breeding therapy dogs for veterans. The resulting film, titled Benjamin's Promise, had aired on the state PBS network and generated an overwhelming response. Letters poured in from across the Midwest, families sharing their own stories of loss and healing, veterans describing their struggles with isolation, children writing to thank Grace and Tommy for showing them that heroes come in many forms. The local post office had to assign a special clerk just to handle the volume of mail addressed to the Benjamin family on Maple Street. But it was the unexpected visitors that truly transformed Grace's understanding of what family could mean. First came Robert Chen, a Vietnam veteran from Iowa City whose service dog had recently died. He'd driven 3 hours just to meet Benjamin and ended up staying for Sunday dinner, sharing stories that made Tommy laugh for the first time in decades. Then came Sandra Williams, a widow from Ames whose husband had also worked in the Guardian program. She brought photo albums full of pictures showing Harold Thompson at various training facilities, images Grace had never seen of her husband working with wolves and damaged veterans. "Harold saved my Jimmy's life," Sandra had told Grace, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Jimmy came back from Vietnam so broken he couldn't be in the same room with another person, but Harold paired him with a wolf named Thunder, and slowly, so slowly, Jimmy learned to trust again." The most surprising visitor had been Dr. James Patterson, the now retired director of the Guardian program, who traveled from Washington, D.C., to meet the family that had inadvertently preserved one of his program's greatest success stories. "What you've created here," Dr. Patterson told Grace during his visit, "is exactly what we hoped the Guardian program would achieve. Not just healing for individuals, but the creation of communities built around mutual care and understanding." Grace had been particularly moved by his revelation that Harold had secretly maintained contact with dozens of Guardian program veterans over the years, coordinating the placement of therapy animals and providing support networks for men and women who struggled to readjust to civilian life. "Your husband was the unofficial godfather of our entire veteran therapy animal network," Dr. Patterson explained. "He kept detailed records of every placement, followed up on every success and failure, and never stopped believing that the right animal could save a broken life." This revelation had led to the most significant development in Grace's new life. Working with Dr. Patterson and the Modern Veterans Administration, she had established the Harold Thompson Foundation, dedicated to pairing rescue animals with veterans suffering from PTSD and trauma-related disorders. The Foundation's first success story was a young Marine named Maria Santos, who had lost both legs in Afghanistan and had been struggling with severe depression and isolation. Grace and Tommy had worked together to train a rescued German Shepherd mix named Hope, using techniques Benjamin had taught them about patient, non-judgmental companionship. When Maria met Hope, the transformation was immediate and profound. The young veteran, who hadn't smiled in months according to her family, burst into tears of joy as Hope instinctively placed her head in Maria's lap and stayed there for an hour, providing the kind of comfort that no human words could offer. "This is what Harold always knew," Grace told Tommy as they watched Maria take her first steps with Hope's assistance. "Healing happens when we stop trying to fix each other and start just being present with each other." The foundation had grown rapidly, supported by donations from viewers of the PBS documentary and grants from veteran organizations across the country. Grace's house had become an informal headquarters, with a steady stream of volunteers helping to train rescue animals and coordinate placements with veterans in need. Benjamin had assumed the role of senior instructor, teaching younger dogs the subtle art of emotional support through his own example. Grace marveled at his ability to assess each new animal and veteran pairing, somehow knowing which personalities would complement each other. Tommy had blossomed in his role as a peer counselor, using his own journey from isolation to community as a roadmap for other veterans struggling with the transition to civilian life. His gentle manner and hard-won wisdom made him particularly effective with the most damaged cases. "I spent 43 years underground," he would tell new clients, "thinking I was too broken to be around people. But it turns out I wasn't broken. I was just waiting for the right people to show me that being wounded doesn't mean being worthless." Sheriff Morrison had become one of the Foundation's strongest supporters, using his law enforcement connections to identify veterans in crisis and coordinate emergency interventions. His relationship with Tommy had healed old wounds while creating new bonds based on shared service and mutual respect. The most touching development had been Tommy's decision to legally change his name to Thomas Morrison Whitman, honoring both the family that had raised him and the Civil War orphan whose story had started their entire journey. The ceremony at the Cedar Falls Courthouse had drawn over 100 people, including Margaret Whitman and her extended family, who had formally welcomed Tommy as an honorary member of their clan. As autumn painted the Iowa countryside in shades of gold and crimson, Grace found herself sitting on her front porch with a contentment she hadn't experienced since Harold's death. Tommy was in the garden, harvesting the last of the tomatoes with Benjamin supervising from his favorite shady spot. 3 rescue dogs were playing in the yard, recent graduates of their training program, soon to be placed with veterans who needed them. The phone rang constantly now with requests for help, interviews with journalists, and reports from successful placements across the Midwest. Grace's quiet retirement had become a full-time mission, but she'd never felt more purposeful or alive. That evening, as she wrote in the journal she'd started keeping to document their work, Grace reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them all together. A lonely widow, a traumatized veteran, and a specially trained dog had found each other through a combination of loss, loyalty, and the kind of stubborn hope that refuses to accept that broken things can't be made whole again. The final entry in Benjamin Morrison's Civil War journal had read, "If we don't make it through this, know that saving Thomas was the most important thing I ever did." Grace realized that Benjamin, both the Civil War hero and the remarkable dog, had fulfilled that promise across generations, creating a legacy of rescue that continued to save lives more than a century and a half later. Outside her window, Benjamin raised his grizzled head and looked directly at her, his ice-blue eyes reflecting the porch light like ancient stars. In that gaze, Grace saw not just intelligence and loyalty, but the accumulated wisdom of all the broken souls he'd helped heal, all the families he'd helped create, all the love he'd helped restore. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new veterans in need of hope, new animals waiting to fulfill their purpose as healers, but tonight, Grace Thompson was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by the family that love had built, one rescued heart at a time. Message for listeners. Dear friends, Grace's story reminds us that our most profound purpose often emerges from our deepest pain. At 61, feeling invisible and forgotten, Grace discovered that her greatest chapter was still unwritten. Like many of us who've lost spouses, raised families, and wondered if our best days are behind us, Grace learned that love doesn't retire. It just finds new ways to serve. Her empty nest became a sanctuary for healing souls. Her quiet grief transformed into active compassion. Sometimes we think we're too old to make a difference, too tired to start over, too wounded to help others heal. But Grace's journey shows us that our scars become our qualifications, our losses become our calling, and our loneliest moments can become the foundation for the most meaningful connections of our lives. Every day you wake up is another chance to be someone's Benjamin, patient, loyal, and healing. What moment in your life seemed like an ending but turned out to be a beginning? Have you ever found unexpected purpose during your most difficult season? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.